In the early 2000s, there was one undisputed king of the mobile world. You probably owned one, an indestructible plastic brick that could survive a nuclear blast and hold a battery charge for a week. At their absolute peak, Nokia controlled half the global smartphone market. Then, a man in a black turtleneck stood on a stage in California, unveiled a sheet of glass, and Nokia was annihilated. It is the most famous cautionary tale in modern business. Apple killed Nokia. The graveyard of tech history is full of household names that failed to adapt. But what if the story we have all been told is a lie? What if the company that Apple supposedly destroyed is actually collecting billions of dollars from Apple every single year? Look at the phone sitting next to you right now. If you are in the United States, there is a very high probability it has a half-eaten apple stamped on the back. It is a masterpiece of modern engineering, a supercomputer that fits in your pocket. It streams ultra-high-definition video, tracks your biometrics, and beams encrypted messages across the globe in milliseconds. But hidden beneath that polished titanium and glass is a secret tax. An invisible toll booth built decades ago by engineers in freezing Finnish laboratories. Every single time you send an iMessage, every time you connect to a cellular network, a fraction of a cent is quietly extracted. That money travels thousands of miles across the Atlantic directly into the corporate vaults of Nokia. The narrative we have all accepted is that Nokia is a relic, a company that built great hardware for a bygone era, failed to understand the touchscreen revolution, and was rightfully slaughtered by Silicon Valley. We view them with nostalgia, not as a present-day threat. We remember playing Snake on a tiny monochrome screen, not orchestrating multi-billion-dollar legal shakedowns. But corporate reality is rarely as simple as a headline. While the world watched Nokia's hardware division spectacularly collapse, eventually being sold off to Microsoft in a humiliating fire sale, a very different entity was quietly consolidating power in the shadows. They were no longer interested in building phones, they were weaponizing ideas. Nokia realized something fundamental before almost anyone else in the technology sector. The true power in the digital age does not belong to the company that manufactures the glass screen, the microchips, or the aluminum chassis. The ultimate power belongs to the company that owns the underlying mathematics of how those devices communicate. They stopped fighting a losing war over plastic hardware and instead laid claim to the invisible airwaves themselves. Today, Apple is a $3 trillion behemoth. They dictate terms to global suppliers, control the fates of millions of app developers, and hold more cash reserves than many sovereign nations. Yet, they are legally forced to write massive recurring checks to Nokia. Samsung, Google, and practically every other manufacturer on Earth are trapped in the exact same web. Nokia did not die. They simply evolved from a consumer electronics brand into an apex predator of intellectual property. How exactly did a defeated company from the Nordic Circle manage to build a legal fortress so impregnable that even the richest tech giants on the planet cannot break it? To understand the sheer scale of this invisible tax, we have to look past the hardware graveyard. We have to rewind the clock to a time before smartphones existed, to uncover how Nokia systematically bought the rights to the future of human communication. To truly comprehend the sheer scale of the invisible tax collected by Nokia today, we have to look away from the glittering tech campuses of modern Silicon Valley. We have to rewind the clock to the late 1980s and travel to a frozen landscape in Northern Europe. At that time, Nokia was not exactly a technological powerhouse. In fact, if you lived in Finland, you probably knew them as a diversified conglomerate, a manufacturer of rubber boots, paper products, and electrical cables. But inside the company's executive boardrooms, a radical, almost reckless gamble was taking shape. They were about to pivot the entire weight of their empire toward a nascent, unproven concept: mobile telecommunications. What followed was one of the most aggressive capital allocations in corporate history. Throughout the 1990s, Nokia didn't just participate in the mobile revolution, they effectively bankrolled its underlying architecture. They began pouring unprecedented billions of dollars into research and development. By the turn of the millennium, Nokia's R&D budget dwarfed those of their rivals, operating with the kind of financial firepower usually reserved for sovereign militaries. They built sprawling, highly secretive laboratories where thousands of the world's brightest engineers were tasked with solving abstract problems most companies didn't even know existed yet. While the public would eventually become obsessed with the physical phones themselves, the interchangeable, colorful plastic covers, the polyphonic ringtones, the endless hours spent playing Snake, the real magic was happening entirely out of sight. Nokia's engineers were literally writing the source code for human communication in the 21st century. They were standardizing GSM, the first truly global digital cellular network. They were laying the complex mathematical foundation for 3G, figuring out how to compress heavy digital data and transmit it across radio waves at speeds previously thought impossible. They weren't just designing consumer devices to connect to a network, they were inventing the very physics of the network itself. And this is where the corporate thriller truly begins. Because Nokia didn't just invent these underlying technologies, they ruthlessly and systematically patented them. Every breakthrough in signal compression, every mathematical equation for battery efficiency, every microscopic protocol for how a cell tower shakes hands with a mobile device was immediately locked down in their filing cabinets. They were behaving less like a traditional electronics manufacturer and more like digital colonizers, aggressively claiming territory in an invisible landscape. They realized early on that whoever owned the patents to these fundamental communication protocols would hold a monopoly over the future. A competitor could always design a prettier phone, but they could not build a phone that circumvented the laws of physics Nokia had just patented. They were building an impenetrable legal fortress, brick by brick, patent by patent, years before their competitors even understood that a war for the airwaves had been declared. This unparalleled era of innovation granted Nokia absolute supremacy. They had successfully built the invisible highways of the modern world and positioned themselves as the sole toll collectors. By the mid-2000s, their global power seemed absolute, their scientific moat entirely uncrossable. But how long can a company maintain unquestioned dominance over the future before arrogance blinds them to an entirely new kind of threat? As Nokia's executives sat safely inside their fortress of intellectual property, the consumer landscape was about to violently shift, setting the stage for one of the most catastrophic corporate blind spots in modern history. By the dawn of 2007, Nokia was not just a company, it was a global monolith. They manufactured over half the smartphones on the planet. Their supply chains spanned continents, their factories pumped out hundreds of millions of devices, and their brand was synonymous with the very concept of cellular connection. They had reached the pinnacle of corporate success, sitting high atop a mountain built of indestructible plastic and unparalleled battery life. They were, by all traditional business metrics, entirely untouchable. But on January 9th of that year, a seismic shift occurred. At the Macworld convention in San Francisco, Steve Jobs stepped onto a stage and pulled a sleek, buttonless rectangle of glass from his pocket. The iPhone was not just a new device, it was an existential threat. It fundamentally redefined what a mobile phone was supposed to be, shifting the paradigm away from a device used primarily for phone calls into a pocket-sized personal computer driven by software and a multi-touch screen. Inside Nokia's headquarters, the initial reaction was not panic, but dismissal. Their engineers, the architects of the airwaves who had practically invented modern telecommunications, looked at the iPhone and scoffed. To them, Apple's new device was an overpriced toy. It failed Nokia's rigorous physical drop tests, its battery life was abysmal. It didn't even run on the faster 3G networks that Nokia had helped pioneer. Blinded by their own historical success, Nokia's executive board fundamentally misunderstood the threat. They believed consumers would always prioritize durable hardware and superior call quality over a flashy, unproven user interface. This was the ultimate manifestation of the innovator's dilemma. Nokia's internal culture had devolved into bureaucratic paralysis. The company was divided into warring factions, with middle managers terrified of delivering bad news to the executives at the top. Their proprietary operating system, Symbian, was a clunky, outdated mess of code, entirely ill-equipped to handle the fluid, app-centric future Apple had just introduced. By the time Google released the Android operating system to the masses, outfitting Nokia's competitors with the exact software weapons needed to fight back against Apple, Nokia was already bleeding out. From 2008 to 2010, the world watched in real time as a titan hemorrhaged market share. Consumers abandoned Nokia in droves, opting for the seamless ecosystems of iOS and Android. The sheer velocity of Nokia's collapse sent shockwaves through the financial world. In a desperate bid to stop the bleeding, the board appointed a new CEO in late 2010, Stephen Elop, a former Microsoft executive. Months into his tenure, Elop authored one of the most infamous documents in corporate history, an internal memo that leaked to the global press. It was known as the Burning Platform. Elop compared Nokia to a man standing on an exploding oil rig in the North Sea. He bluntly told his employees that remaining on the platform meant certain death, and that to survive, they had to take a terrifying jump into the icy, unknown waters below. But when a monolithic empire finally realizes it is standing on a burning platform, what happens to the invisible treasures locked away deep inside its foundation? Nokia took the jump, but they leaped straight into a catastrophic partnership. Elop aligned Nokia exclusively with Microsoft's unproven Windows Phone operating system, shunning the wildly popular Android platform. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Windows Phone ecosystem lacked the apps, the developer support, and the consumer appeal to compete. Sales flatlined. The once untouchable global giant had been reduced to an industry afterthought, burning through cash reserves just to keep the lights on. By 2013, the spectacular failure was complete. The company that quite literally built the modern mobile world was forced to surrender. In a humiliating multi-billion-dollar fire sale, Nokia sold its entire mobile phone division along with its legendary manufacturing capabilities to Microsoft. The transaction was widely written up as an obituary. The news anchors delivered the postmortems. The brand was stripped, the physical factories were handed over, and the public definitively closed the book on the Finnish giant. To the average consumer watching at home, Nokia was completely dead and buried. But while the world was staring at the tombstone of Nokia's hardware business, they completely missed what Microsoft didn't buy. Because deep in the fine print of that historic acquisition, Nokia quietly retained ownership of the one thing that actually mattered. The physical phones were gone, but the vault containing the mathematical secrets of the universe remained locked in Finland. And the architects of the airwaves were about to unleash a masterpiece of corporate revenge. When Microsoft bought Nokia's hardware division for over $7 billion, the financial press wrote it up as a complete corporate liquidation. But Microsoft only bought the factories, the brand name, and the plastic. They did not buy the vault. Hidden safely in Finland was a portfolio of tens of thousands of distinct patent families. This was the raw, concentrated output of those decades spent pouring unprecedented billions into research and development. Nokia was no longer a consumer electronics manufacturer. Overnight, they became a pure intellectual property holding company. And this transition marked the beginning of a ruthless masterclass in high-stakes corporate law. To understand the absolute genius of Nokia's survival, you must understand a specialized legal concept known as the Standard Essential Patent, or SEP. In the technology industry, there are generally two types of patents. The first is a standard design or utility patent. Apple, for instance, can patent the specific shape of a glass screen or the precise way an application icon bounces. If a competitor wants to build a smartphone, they can simply design around it. They can make their screen a different dimension, or make their icons fade instead of bounce. But a standard essential patent is entirely different. It protects the foundational technology that an entire global industry has agreed must be used to make a system function. Think of it this way. When the global telecommunications industry gathered to decide exactly how 3G, 4G, and Wi-Fi networks would physically operate, how a cell tower would encrypt a voice signal, compress the data, and beam it to a moving receiver without dropping the connection, they chose the most efficient mathematical solutions available. And overwhelmingly, those specific solutions had been invented and legally locked down by the engineers at Nokia. You cannot design around a standard essential patent. If you want your device to connect to a global cellular network, you must use Nokia's exact underlying mathematics. Apple had successfully built the most luxurious, highly desired sports car in the world, but Nokia owned the asphalt, the traffic lights, and the invisible highways those cars needed to drive on. But owning the highway is useless if the law prevents you from charging a toll. This is where a critical international framework called FRAND comes into play. FRAND stands for Fair, Reasonable, and Non-Discriminatory Licensing. It is a legal agreement designed to prevent companies that hold essential patents from acting like tyrannical monopolies and shutting down global progress. Under FRAND rules, Nokia is legally obligated to allow anyone, even their fiercest corporate rivals, to use their essential technology. They cannot play favorites, and they cannot permanently block Apple or Google from accessing the mobile network. On the surface, FRAND sounds like a regulatory handicap, but in the hands of a company holding the largest portfolio of networking patents on Earth, it is actually the ultimate unbreakable business moat. Because while Nokia is forced to share their technology, the Fair and Reasonable clause guarantees they must be financially compensated for it. Every single manufacturer who wants to build a modern smartphone must sit down at the negotiating table with Nokia and sign a licensing agreement. It is an inescapable, legally mandated toll booth placed squarely in the center of the modern digital economy. By shedding their bloated, money-losing hardware division, Nokia had achieved its final, most lethal corporate form. They had eliminated their manufacturing costs, erased their inventory risks, and completely removed the need for consumer marketing. All they had left was a vault full of paper that gave them the legal right to tax the entire global tech economy. But having the theoretical right to charge a tax and actually collecting the money are two vastly different things. When billions of dollars are suddenly on the line, how exactly does a supposedly defeated company force the richest, most aggressive tech conglomerates on the planet to actually hand over the cash? Having the theoretical right to collect a tax is one thing. Actually walking into the headquarters of the most powerful corporations on Earth and demanding billions of dollars is quite another. When Nokia transformed into a pure intellectual property holding company, they faced a monumental challenge. The Silicon Valley giants, led by Apple, were fiercely protective of their profit margins. They viewed Nokia not as a foundational pioneer deserving of respect, but as a defeated dinosaur attempting to extort them from the grave. The reigning champions of the tech world were not about to hand over their cash voluntarily. They had to be forced. What followed was one of the most aggressive, high-stakes legal bloodbaths in the history of modern business. It was a heavyweight fight that pitted the company that supposedly died against the very company that pulled the trigger. Apple's initial stance was one of absolute defiance. They refused to pay Nokia's proposed licensing fees, arguing that the rates were unreasonable and that Nokia was abusing its position as an owner of standard essential patents. In the eyes of Cupertino, the Finnish engineers were simply overvaluing their aging portfolio. But Nokia was no longer a sluggish hardware manufacturer bogged down by internal politics. Liberated from the burden of building physical products, they had evolved into a streamlined, highly lethal legal machine, and they were about to remind Apple exactly who owned the airwaves. Nokia did not just file a lawsuit. They unleashed a coordinated, multi-continent legal blitzkrieg. They sued Apple in the United States. They sued them in the United Kingdom. They sued them in Germany and the Netherlands. They filed dozens of separate patent infringement claims, targeting everything from the iPhone's user interface and camera technology to the fundamental way its internal antennas communicated with cellular towers. Nokia's strategy was to overwhelm Apple's elite legal teams by attacking the iPhone's core architecture on every possible front, in every major jurisdiction. But lawsuits take years, and tech giants are perfectly comfortable fighting endless battles of attrition in the courtroom. To force an immediate surrender, Nokia needed a nuclear option. So they went directly to the United States International Trade Commission. Nokia argued that because Apple was actively refusing to license the foundational patents required to make their devices function, the iPhone was, legally speaking, a contraband product. Nokia formally requested that the United States government ban the importation of nearly all Apple products into the country. This was the ultimate corporate thriller climax. A Finnish company that the public thought was dead was suddenly holding a legal knife to the throat of the American tech economy. If the ITC agreed with Nokia, iPhones could be physically stopped at the US border. Hundreds of millions of dollars in daily revenue would evaporate. Apple's supply chain would instantly paralyze, and its stock price would face an apocalyptic crash. As the pressure mounted, Apple's legal team rigorously analyzed Nokia's patent portfolio, searching for a weakness, a loophole, any way to invalidate the math. But the fortress was impenetrable. You simply could not build a functional mobile device without triggering Nokia's intellectual property. Faced with the existential threat of an import ban and the undeniable reality of Nokia's mathematical supremacy, Tim Cook capitulated. Apple settled. And they didn't just agree to pay an ongoing fraction of a cent for every new device sold. They were forced to write a massive retroactive check to compensate Nokia for all the years they had refused to pay. The exact dollar amount of the settlement was sealed under strict non-disclosure agreements, but financial analysts estimated it was a lump sum well into the billions, followed by hundreds of millions in guaranteed annual revenue. Nokia had successfully brought the most valuable company in history to its knees. And they didn't stop there. With the Apple settlement in hand as precedent, Nokia systematically hunted down the rest of the industry. Samsung, HTC, BlackBerry, LG. One by one, the biggest brands in the world were dragged to the negotiating table and forced to sign licensing agreements. Nokia had completely flipped the script. They were no longer the victim of the smartphone revolution. They were the landlord. But as Nokia successfully subjugated the smartphone industry and cemented their invisible tax on the present, a much larger question began to loom over the technology sector. What happens when phones are no longer the only things that need to connect to the network? The smartphone wars were over, and Nokia had won the only battle that mattered. Yet deep inside their laboratories, the architects of the airwaves were already patenting the infrastructure for a completely new global revolution, preparing to lay claim to a future far bigger than anything sitting in your pocket.
The smartphone wars are over, and the dust has long since settled. Apple and Samsung won the battle for your pocket, while Nokia secured the invisible airspace above it. But if you think Nokia is simply sitting in a frozen Finnish fortress, quietly cashing royalty checks from aging third- and fourth-generation cellular patents, you are severely underestimating them. The architects of the airwaves did not stop innovating. They simply changed the battlefield. Today, we are standing on the precipice of a massive technological shift. The global rollout of 5G is not just a faster way to download a movie to your iPhone. It is the fundamental infrastructure required for the next leap in human civilization. It is the ultra-low latency backbone needed for autonomous vehicles to safely communicate with city traffic grids in real time. It is the digital nervous system for fully automated robotic factories, smart power grids, and remote surgical technology. As the global economy completely transitions to this hyper-connected reality, a fascinating question emerges. What happens when almost every physical object you interact with suddenly requires a cellular license from a company you assumed died a decade ago? This is the reality of the Internet of Things, and Nokia has been patiently waiting for it. While the public was entirely distracted by the latest consumer gadgets, Nokia was systematically conquering the 5G infrastructure space. They're not just providing the physical cell towers and fiber optic hardware for global telecommunication networks. They are dominating the 5G standard essential patent landscape. They have spent the last 10 years pouring billions of dollars into next-generation research, legally securing the foundational mathematics for how the future of the Internet will operate. The inevitable result is a massive, unprecedented expansion of Nokia's invisible tax. The toll booth is no longer restricted to just mobile phones. Today, when a legacy automaker like Mercedes-Benz, Ford, or Volkswagen builds a modern vehicle equipped with cellular navigation and autonomous safety features, they must sit down at the negotiating table with Nokia. When a logistics conglomerate outfits thousands of cargo containers with real-time global tracking sensors, they are triggering Nokia's intellectual property. Every smart home appliance, every connected medical device, every agricultural drone surveying a field, they all must pay the toll. Nokia has successfully transitioned from taxing a single consumer electronics industry to taxing the entire global industrial complex. They have embedded their intellectual property so deeply into the fabric of the 21st century that they are virtually impossible to extract. Legal challenges from automakers and industrial giants still occasionally flare up, attempting to fight the licensing fees, but the underlying reality remains permanently unchanged. The patents are essential. The math is undeniable. The tax must be paid. We love to tell the story of the smartphone revolution as a tale of spectacular winners and tragic losers. We look back at the indestructible Nokia brick phone with a sense of quaint nostalgia, a relic from a simpler time before the world went digital. We celebrate the visionaries in Silicon Valley who built the glowing glass rectangles we stare at today. But the ultimate lesson of Nokia's survival is much colder and much more brilliant. The greatest, most resilient businesses in the world do not obsess over physical products. Products inevitably break. Trends fade, consumer loyalty vanishes overnight, and competitors will always eventually build a sleeker device. True corporate immortality lies in the invisible. It is found in the patents, the protocols, and the fundamental ideas that make those products possible in the first place. Apple may have convinced the world to buy the phone, but Nokia owns the rights to the future it connects to.